and welcome again to our sixth webinar. Last time, a month ago, we were looking at, in more detail, at the nature of what it is to experience something, particularly what is the lived experience. And I'm going to briefly recap that to set the scene for tonight's presentations and discussions. And then Joanna is going to give a 10-15 minute overview with an exercise. She's got, a review of what is the lived experience, what is a lived experience. And then Jude is going to give a more a theoretical presentation on the four boundaries of the sense perceptible world. Was that correct? Sorry, okay, I'll leave it to you to do it. And he's not sick, he's just got a cold in Melbourne with a blanket around him. And then we'll have a very short break, a comfort break maybe, of 2 to 5 minutes. And then I'm going to go more deeply into what we were looking at last month, and that is the after image of an experience and how we can work, two ways we can work with the after image of an experience and an exercise to go with that. And hopefully we'll have some interesting discussion in between. What we have, the overall picture that we've been working with over the past year is that we've been looking at phenomenology, the nature of it as both a philosophy and as a practice. And we've had various people giving different presentations on how they use phenomenology in their research or in their professional practice. But what everybody has been doing it through the structure of these 4 guiding questions, which we decided were, despite all the sort of different manifestations of what phenomenology is, these 4 practices or these 4 stages cover, you might say, are essential to all approaches. So the first one is first of all, how do I even see with new eyes? How do I develop the sufficient openness? How do I develop what's called in academic circles a phenomenological attitude, where I put aside my everyday taken for granted way of looking at the world and try to see with new eyes? And the second stage is the dwelling. How do I immerse myself into my engagement, my observation with the object I'm working with? And how do I immerse myself repeatedly to deepen and continually deepen the engagement? The third stage is the disclosure, the reveal, which comes to the very essence of what phenomenology is about, the revealing of that which is hidden, but also that which is the very essence of the phenomenon in question. And then the fourth stage is the description. How do I share my experiences? How do I communicate it? How do I write phenomenologically? How can I work with the findings, the results, and how might it inform my professional practice? So those are the 4 guiding structures, just for to give everybody that orientation to phenomenology. And as I said, in last month, we were looking specifically, we decided to go back to that very first step of openness, but really to ask ourselves, how do we experience? What actually is an experience? What is a lived experience as opposed to an experience? You know, because everybody starts talking about lived experience these days. But in phenomenology, it actually has a very particular, again, depending on who you're talking to. So for Henry Bortoft, for him, the lived experience as we study it in phenomenology is is the experience as it is lived, but in the experience of it. And Bortoft has his particular phrase, the way of working with the experiencing, where he talks about going back upstream of the experience into the experiencing of the experience, the appearance, the appearing of the appearance. Whereas Van Manen, he talks about it's about the experience of the experience. It's not about the reflection on the experience. And I think that's often one of the areas where we have this the difference between how it's used in phenomenological practice and how we talk about the experience in general. You know, we say, well, I've got the lived experience of going to Hawaii for a holiday sort of thing. So, but we're actually not talking in phenomenology about a reflection, what Bortoft would say, being downstream of the experience. We're talking about the experience itself. Gadamer says it's not just a lived experience. It's not just something that is any old experience. It's a special experience that gives a very lasting impression. And Dewey, who's not actually a phenomenologist, nevertheless wrote a wonderful book called Art as an Experience. He talks about an experience is, as opposed to your ordinary everyday experience, an experience of the sort that Gadamer and Bortoft and Van Manen are talking about is an experience where one is fully immersed in the experience, which will then eventually lead one to insights and leave you with this sense of a heightened vitality. And it will bring about a change, an openness for new things to emerge. And this is very important, because phenomenology is also the study of the structures of consciousness. And if you really go through a deeply immersive phenomenological process with observation, then there is a certain transformation, and I'm going to talk about that very briefly later on in my presentation. So that's basically the setting for our webinar last time, and then we went on to look at how one can work with deepening, how engaging more deeply with our experiences, so that everyday experiences can become lived more these fully immersed experiences. And we worked with Arthur Zience's cognitive breathing exercise. And his cognitive breathing exercise, just to bring up the diagram, he was talking about it in relation to meditation, but Zience was also, apart from a physicist, he was a phenomenologist, and he probably would still consider phenomenology to be his prime methodology. So we were working with cognitive breathing exercise, where you're moving between focused attention and open attention. So engaging with the center and then sending one's awareness to the periphery, and then repeating that cycle again. So the focused attention, then you let it go and you sit back and you send your awareness to the periphery and allow the possibility for something new to come into that space. And Zience sometimes refers to this as allowing the after image of the experience to come into that space. So at this point, I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to hand you over to Joanna, who's going to give us her thoughts on this process. And I will spotlight you first of all.
Thank you so much, Fiona, for reiterating that so clearly. I was actually not able to attend the last iteration of the stream of life. But I did listen and watch the recording, and I sent Fiona some feedback on that, and she asked me if I would just bring that to this month's episode. So it's great to have that reminder of the structural ideas as a solid ground to start unpacking the essence of a lived experience from my viewpoint as a drama therapist, and to try and bring my impressions of last time in a way that hopefully communicates my own joy in the aliveness and alertness that comes from these exercises, and particularly Zayong's practice. So, as Fiona's explained about the practice of cognitive breathing, it was so helpful to have that, the difference between the focused and the open attention. And it was wonderful to hear Zayong's own voice to follow this process. So he had a sounding of it sounded like a Buddhist bowl, but it was actually called a bell exercise. And as when he sounded that, we were asked to focus on that sound very much for our own person, and then after a while to go into open attention, which was less about our personal, this is how I understood it, our personal sense, but a much more general sense in that open attention. And then Fiona and Jude gave us suggestions about going back and forth in imagination and being aware of the first part in our open attention of that sound, and then of the focused attention, I beg your pardon, at first, of that sound, and then into the open attention the second time. Go back and forth and keep the awareness of the other in our minds at the same time, the personal and the general significance, without being distracted by it. So that was a really excellent exercise for not going into that reflective process, but to keep my lived experience and my estimation of the other's lived experience into parts, but to connect them. I think my way of doing this surrounding the lived experience of my clients is not dissimilar as a drama therapist, but usually made with a drawing or a body movement. So going not from a sound like the bowl or the bell, but from a picture of the client to the artistic response and then back again. Either a drawing, a visual, or a embodiment experience. I realized from the exercise that I don't do the gratitude response, which was involved in Zayong's description, deeply enough. So that was a real learning on my part. Also, this exercise showed me how to be more disciplined and patient with the mind movements to and fro. I found I could not just sit in the chair and do this, even with my arthritic challenges, which make the chair a more comfortable option, because the embodiment is so important. So I had to get up and do this. So I would like to also repeat the poem that Fiona brought after this exercise and give an exercise for people here, whether you've heard the poem before or not, of this embodying the experience. So I'd like you to be comfortable either in your chair or standing up, whichever way you like, and shut your eyes and take some breaths as I read the poem. And observing what happens in your body. So I'll read it twice. And it's helpful that the poem is actually about embodiment as well. Through all beings stretches the one space, world in a space. The birds fly quietly through us. Oh, I wish to grow. I look out, and inside me, the tree grows. I'm going to read it again. Through all beings stretches the one space, world in a space. The birds fly quietly through us. Oh, I wish to grow. I look out, and inside me, the tree grows. And take a moment before you open your eyes. And then I'd like you to embody in a body sculpt in some way of presenting your body on screen if you would like to. You don't have to do this, but if you would like to do that, to just embody that sense that of the lived experience that you came to in the poem. I'm going to go with mine. Anybody who wishes to can go with theirs. And look at each other. Thank you. So I want to just say that I love the way it relates to Merleau-Ponty's view of entering into the external phenomena and having the external phenomena enter into us. It's as though those two philosopher poets knew each other. I found a similar circumstance with just sitting for Jude's interesting work. I found he brought a story from the New Testament, and it was the story of changing water into wine. I found I wanted some people there, actually, more than that, I wanted some people there in my study to play the roles of Christ and his mother in that story, in the miracle of changing the water into wine. And wanting to rehearse the conversation a few times, Jude asked us to take a part of that story and work with that, with the exercise we'd been through before. Rehearsing, I wanted to rehearse the conversation a few times, deepening each time and holding the sacred space. So it was a very big exercise. I did have the advantage of, we were given the choice of which part of that story we honed into. I had the advantage of honing in straight away onto the conversation between Christ and Mary, because within that well-known story, their relationship really spoke to me more deeply than the rest of the text. And I thank Jude for the opportunity to work with it. So really, that's come to the end of my review, and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Joanna. Thanks for that. I don't know if anybody who was also here last time, a month ago. I was going to say last week, but it was last month. who took the opportunity to work with the cognitive breathing exercise themselves over the past month. It's really a month ago. And who had any particular thoughts that they'd like to share on this, because this is, after all, supposed to be a discussion, not just presentations. So anybody who was here last time like to share any thoughts? Go on, Kate. Unmute yourself.
Okay. So I'll jump in. I didn't have any particular about that exercise, but when we did it, I recognised it is, the same exercise as meditation. And, getting to that place of focusing, letting it go, waiting, maybe something coming, maybe not, going back to focusing to a point where, you let it go. At the moment, I'm doing 2 verses in my meditation. So it is that, that's why I love this. It speaks to my work and to my path, I guess, in a path. And probably everybody recognises that. Am I being naive? I don't know.
No, not at all. In fact, I think it's a really important point that that the fact, first of all, that it speaks to your work. Yeah, that's one of the. This is not just about having a nice discussion about a theory or a philosophical approach to life. It's how does this inform the way I work? Yeah, how can I use this? How does this change me? So yeah, I know. I think that's and also something that I didn't mention, and I don't think Joanna did either, is that the Arthur Zients gave that cognitive breathing exercise in relation to contemplative practice. However, I know others, probably Joanna as well, have also used it in our phenomenological research. So found it a very good structure. So that's why, and as I said, Zions himself has a phenomenology background, and he you know, and it comes from, I gave the book, the title of his book in the references last time, and I've also got those same references, will be at the end of this video recording as well. Okay. Don't know if anybody else has any thoughts.
I didn't actually hear any of that because my computer froze. I don't know whether everybody else's did that today. But don't repeat it, it's okay. I'll listen to the recording.
No? Okay, good. All right. I thought it might have been me if it froze, but that's you. Okay, let's go on. Jude, over to you.
Thank you. I thought tonight it would be good to focus on a particular aspect of this process, and thank you, Joanna, for mentioning it in that way, especially that poem where it ends, as I'm looking out there, the tree grows in me, or, the process of being in what I'm perceiving and what I'm perceiving growing inside me. And Fiona will bring some exercise on the afterimage process that works with that. But I have found it to be extremely helpful in the study, so to say, of phenomenology, which is the study of the forms of consciousness, to understand a little bit some of the state of the modern consciousness that most of us live with. And so I've been working with the first two lectures of Rudolf Steiner's first volume of Cosmosophy. Don't ask me what the volume number is. I haven't got my library behind me. I'm not at home. So Cosmosophy lectures 1 and 2, where he's talking predominantly about the destruction furnace beneath our memory in our etheric body. Which also is represented in our digestive system, but it's a bigger process than that. And in those two lectures, he talks about the 4 boundaries given to our consciousness. So for me, this is a study of the forms of consciousness for predominantly, I suppose, maybe Western minded people. Other cultures may have a different constitution around these things. But in our consciousness, we are boundaried in 4 places due to the need for our self to be a being that can process the world individually. So it's not that it's well, it is a problem, I suppose, but it's something we need to be aware of, I've found, in our process of coming to engage with the sense world in particular. So I'll name the 4 boundaries, but I will only maybe explore the 1 or maybe 2. So the 1 boundary is that we are boundaried in the direction of the senses. So when we look out, or when we perceive the world through the senses, we meet a boundary as to how far we can go in perceiving it. And I'd like to explain in a moment a little bit more about that process. We are also boundaried in our thinking. So this was Steiner's critique of Immanuel Kant, was Kant said that we reach a certain ceiling of what we can know. There's an upper ceiling to what we can know. And Steiner said, no, there's only a boundary in as far as we can go with our reason. And after that, we can use, in the same sense as Kant suggested, we can use a process called faith to learn more about what is beyond the boundary of what we can carry in our consciousness with our current processing and our thinking. The third boundary then is, we could say, downwards. So if the senses are out front, the thinking's up. The downward process, or the downward boundary in our consciousness, is that of the memory. and he calls it, yeah, thank you, Tim, GA 207, Cosmosophy Volume 1, GA 207. The first two lectures in there in particular, I mean, the whole volume, of course, both volumes are really valuable, but this is very much in the first two lectures. So in the sense of that downwards, when we create memory, which we also know, or we will discover more, that the after image process has something to do with the creation of memories, but we have a boundary as to what we can remember. You know, there's a whole part of memory that we can't access, and that's part of the development of the forms and structures of memory into the future, where we will be able to access more and more personal memory, but also historical memory. And then the fourth boundary, which we could say is behind us, is the boundary to our ego consciousness. So that we could say goes back in time. Our ego consciousness is boundaried back in time, in the astral, into the embryological development, and into the ego consciousness, into our pre-birth experience, which is where the astral body and our ego go when we sleep. They don't just go up into the spiritual world. Steiner says they don't go spatially, they go into time. So the astral body at night goes back into the memory of the embryological development, and the ego goes back into the preconceptual or preconception phase of our preparation for our birth. But we're boundaried in knowing that there's a certain, we could say even veiled. Boundary isn't necessarily a good word, but it's veiled. The veiling is another thing. And so our everyday consciousness has these veils, or these places where we need to penetrate through further. So in the sense maybe tonight of trying to understand that without going into all four, because I think they actually have a lot to do with each of the four processes of phenomenology, but we can explore that later or in another webinar. And when it comes to the beholding or the dwelling on something, one of the 12 senses, so even a thought or a word, whatever it is that our senses are dwelling upon or engaging with, it's helpful for me to know how that works. So when we are using the senses, we're using the sentient soul and the sentient body quite strongly, in the sense, in the engagement of the sense organ with the phenomenon that it's dwelling upon. And there's a description Steiner gives of that the sentient soul goes out of the sense organ as far as there's a will in our sentient soul. There's a will that our sentient soul stretches like a tentacle to touch the phenomenon, whether it's a sound or an object, whatever it is. And we can imagine, you could try to imagine that our sentient soul and body stretch to touch the tree, say, if we just use that as an example of the Rilke poem. When I'm looking at that, we can feel that there's a will within me, in my sentient soul, to reach the phenomenon. And then obviously there's a process by which that comes into our sense organ, and then, as we will experience next, there's an after image process with that. However, there's another part to it, which is that, especially, well, in any object, there is also, and this is part of the boundary. So we with our sentient soul, we will find the physical boundary of let's say at this point, let's just stick to nature. I mean, there's many other realms of sense perception, but let's just say, for sake of ease of understanding, my sentient soul reaches the tree, and I'm touching the tree, and we can in a way feel how the tree grows in me. But how does that happen? Because within the object or the phenomenon, wisdom lies hidden. So we know that from Steiner's cosmology that we have out of ancient moon a cosmos of wisdom, that within that nature is imbued with wisdom. So even our bodies, everything, and every creation that the human being makes, in fact, has a certain wisdom to it. It might not be as sublime as that of the seraphim or or that, but you know, if we make a piece of technology or an art piece, we imbue a certain wisdom into the object. And that wisdom that lies within, I'm going to say within, but we could say behind the physical body of the tree, we could say the wisdom of the tree has a will to reveal itself to us. And this will within the phenomenon, it reaches towards us. And this will of wisdom that comes from the phenomenon and the will that comes from our sense organ meet. And there's a few attitudes of soul that will allow this meeting to commune with each other. The first is the beginning of knowledge of the higher worlds, which is, you know, awe and reverence. So in the awe towards the wisdom in the world, I allow the meeting of the will of the object and the will of my sentient soul to meet. And through that, the tree can live in me. And then the step to thinking maybe would be then in my reverence to the truth. So and both of these require the deep feeling of love. So it is on the warmth of love towards the object and the love towards the truth that this wisdom can actually start to become commune with my own understanding. So the wisdom starts to live in my thinking through this process. I'm not going to go into the ego and into the memory tonight, but that might be some sort of grist for our thinking in being able to be aware of the forms of consciousness as a modern human being. That how do we actually learn to see, you know, so how do we actually develop new ways of seeing? We need to become, I think we need to become aware of the veiling or the limitation of what my physical senses can do, and how, just as, you know, Steiner sort of said, we can go beyond the limitation of understanding that Immanuel Kant described by learning how to have thinking that isn't based on the senses and on the brain thinking. We can expand our thinking by sense-free thinking, but so too can we expand what the senses can perceive by developing this awe for the object, the awe for the wisdom within it, and the reverence for the truth, carried by the warmth of love, as part of the technology of developing a new way of seeing based upon the limitation of our own sensorium at this point. And of course, each individual is unique in that, and each culture has a different way of limitation with that or not. So I remember sitting with an Indigenous elder in Adelaide. We were doing a sorry business at an open-faced mine not far from Mount Barker. It was called Brukanga, which is the death or the end of the story of Chilbrookie, which is the fire bringer. It's a Parites mine, so the lightning strikes there a lot, and the settlers started doing open-faced mining and dug away half the mountain. And of course, now the rain leaches the heavy metals from the open face, and there's a great disaster in the waters going into the Murray River. Cattle are being born infertile, etc., etc. But we sat there to do sorry business, and we were just looking at it. And we were talking about our experience afterwards. And his experience was he just saw the mountain as it was before the mining. He could still see the etheric mountain. I had to struggle to even begin seeing that, but he could, in his looking, see beyond just the physical damaged mountain. He said, I see the mountain as it always has been. There's other natural capacities still in other communities maybe to work with that. But I'll leave that for that tonight. Maybe that's enough for tonight. Thanks, Fiona. Should we take that little break, or should we just continue?
Is there any thoughts or comments from anybody about what Jude's, or questions, or Tim?
That was phenomenal. Jude, thank you so much to be taken through that exercise. For me personally, having come back to Australia from the UK after many years, and I've trying to settle myself into place. I look at the world around me, and I see people's houses and their cars, and I can feel that dynamic that you're talking about between that reaching out and something coming back. And your presentation is really helpful to dwell on the wills that, my will reaching out and the will that's there coming back towards me. Yeah, that was really good. Thank you.
Yeah, and Steiner describes that as a communion. It's a real communion. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, I could just share an experience I had that relates to that. Was an exercise in it was part of the Goethean nature course with Craig Holdridge, and to observe over a long period of time one plant. Well, it could be anything actually, but I chose a plant. One phenomena of nature, and I chose a plant, and I didn't know anything about this plant, and it was an exercise that I felt kind of I had to do, and didn't really think too much about it, so I had to choose it. So I chose a plant that looked attractive to me. It had interesting leaves. When I held the leaves up to the sun, I could see the veins of the leaves through it, and it kind of glowed. So I thought, well, this is interesting. And I observed it over a period of about 2 years, and went back to it every, sometimes a couple of weeks apart, sometimes a month apart. And it was quite strange. It became actually quite in my thoughts a lot, how this plant was doing, what this plant would think about this, and then I started having these new thoughts that I'd never had before. And I thought, well, is this the plant giving them to me? So all this is very, very subjective and perhaps unscientific, but it resonates with what you said about this communion idea, where there's something within the object or the phenomena that provides something in me that wasn't there before, rather than just its superficial appearance. It actually goes into, it felt like it was going into my thinking, if you know what I mean. Yeah.
Into your thinking or into your understanding? And that might not be differentiable, but
well, actually, I was getting these thoughts that I had nothing that had related to this observational process.
So it was a thought, yeah.
But they are ideas that I don't know where they came from previously.
Okay, good.
And they were of a different nature to, general thinking.
It was thinking at first, a thought. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting, actually, Mark.
Yeah.
You might have something more to say about that after
our next section.
Our next section on the after image and the nature of the after image and what appears after you let go of the after image, which is what I want to talk about, both from the kind of the theoretical and also my experience of this in my research and also in my practice. So I think what we'll do now is have a 5-minute break, stretch legs, get a drink, something like that, and come back in 5 minutes. Okay, so let's move on to looking more deeply at this after image that we worked with a little bit last session. And I'm just going to bring up the slide with the cognitive breathing diagram again, just so that I can just elaborate just what in particular. So one of the tendencies, I think, often in observational work is the tendency to focus on this aspect, the focused attention. Yeah, we focus in, we observe, we make note of our observations. We may then recall the observation, try if it's an image or a sound, as we worked with last time with the bell exercise. We recall it to memory, and there's often then, although it's used in meditation, I think this is one of the reasons where the crossover between meditation and phenomenology has a very important meeting place, and why many phenomenologists say that phenomenology is a contemplative process. It's a path of contemplative inquiry. And this is because of this, the benefits really of this second part of what Zions is calling his cognitive breathing exercise, and that is the open attention, the receptivity space. And when you've let go, so just to reiterate his steps, there is the observation of the object, the engagement, the immersion in the object, and then you recall it to memory as the second step. And the third step then is to let the image go, or let your memory of it go, and send your attention. He calls this receptive. In other places, here it's called open attention. In other places he calls it receptive attentiveness. So you send your attention to the periphery, you send it out, but you make yourself receptive like a vessel to experiences that then may come to you. The after image, a kind of an after image, a sort of, which may not necessarily, and I'm also using the term image here, not just to mean pictures, but also to mean, it could be a sound, or it could be an embodied experience, something like that. And the importance of this after image, that comes into the space. So the importance of taking the time to make the space in oneself after an experience. So as we touched on last week, and that in our everyday life, and particularly in our modern world, our tendency is we can have quite amazing experiences, but the pace of our life and the demands of our life mean that we're already onto something else. We don't have time to go through that breathing out with it. We've breathed it in, but we don't have the breathing out. And we don't have allow that experience to drop down into our soul life and be worked upon. Unless, of course, then you are repeating, as Mark was just describing to us, where he spent 2 years observing the same plant. And then, of course, this is continued immersion starts to build something which, go on with, look at just what Zions, for instance, discusses here. But it is important, this opening up of a space where something comes towards you from the object, from the world, and developing the capacity for allowing that space to open up. And so this is the importance of then not only this developing this receptiveness that is also attentive, but also becoming aware of the after image of the experience. And as I said, the after image can be an inner gesture. It might be a color, it might be a sound, it might be a bodily sensation, or it may be, just something that you can't quite grasp the first or second time, but there is this sense of a response somehow that comes from the object. And if one does this cognitive breathing exercise repeatedly, and of course, with this lemniscate, it's not that one does it once, the attentive and then the open, but you actually have to keep repeating it. This is part of the constant re-immersion that phenomenologists talk about. You constantly have to immerse yourself again and again, make careful observations. But the other side of that is that as the more often you do this and the more deeply you do this, the more you build this inner world of the after image of what you start to cultivate an inner world that is both corresponds both imaginatively to the object, to the meditation object or the object we're observing, but also becomes very precise the more you do it. And what we always want, of course, we don't want just fantasy arising in us. We want to become quite precise with the imaginations that arise in us. So in a way that the outer language of the object starts to find an inner response in us, an inner language, just as the Rilke verse, I look out, oh, I who wish to grow, I look out, and inside me the tree grows. So this reciprocal. And I don't know how many of you saw the advertising for this webinar, but I used this quote from Parker Palmer, who is a well-known American writer and works in social justice and has worked with science a little bit in the past. And he says, every way of knowing becomes a way of living. And I'd like to paraphrase that and say, every new way of seeing becomes a new way of knowing, which becomes a new way of living. Because when we go back to this nature of consciousness and how this moving between myself and the world, between focused attention and attention open to the world and what comes to meet me from the world, and of course, not just the physical world, but we're actually talking about from the soul's spiritual experience, then we have then the possibility that our own being will change by doing this, yeah? Something will change in us, as Goethe calls it, this new organ of perception. And so he, I got the next slide, yeah. So there's actually these two stages to do with the after image. One is the after image itself, which is the soul's after image. So this inner world that you build up. But then the stage after that is developing developing insights out of becoming aware of the spiritual activity behind or within the image. And again, using the term image, not just to mean picture image, but any kind of, sound image or whatever. And so I just want to talk a little bit in my own experience of when many years ago when I was doing my doctoral research, I was very much I was using this after image. I don't know if I deliberately decided to use it. I can't remember now, but it came up in my research that it was actually, I was using what Henry Bortoff calls, I was using this, trying to capture the upstream experience in the experiencing, but also the downstream experience of how it resonated in people after the experience. So to do this, I had people, so just my research subject was actually looking at the way we think when we're engaged in creative activity. So in other words, what does it actually mean? What is the experience of being creative? But looking at the thinking, how we process, how we think, our cognitive processing in this. And so in the upstream experience, I was doing a workshop where people were doing drawing exercises. And as they were doing the drawing exercise, it was a 2-hour workshop, they were writing field notes. So they were capturing how their experience, how they were experiencing the drawing exercises as they were doing them. And then 2 months later, I interviewed quite a number of them, and I asked them what their experience was. That was sort of the overall picture. And this is really then the downstream experience. And I realized, this is where I realized this is what I was getting from people after I spent time. I must say, as I've said before in this webinar, I spent 2, 3, 4 years on the analysis, on the repeated immersion into my data, which I had a tremendous amount, of course, as one does. Then I realized that what I was getting was like an after image of the initial experiencing, that the upstream and the downstream. The downstream, I was getting an after image, what resonated in the soul. Because what people said in the interviews 2 months later, as was their experience, was somewhat different to what they wrote in their field notes. And often they didn't even recall why they'd written something in their field notes. But one of the particular things that they said was that although the upstream experience was that they had, they enjoyed it, but they also felt a lot of tension, the uncertainty of working with a creative process. But when they recalled it 2 months later, their recollection of the experience, what rose up in their soul through, and I mean, I had quite a very particular process in order to bring this about in people, is that they described having a kind of their after image was fulfilled, a kind of a sense, it left them with a sense of fulfilled well-being, which is what Dewey talks about, is what, he describes that when you have a true lived experience, then you will feel more alive. So this is what my participants were saying. But what they also said is that it brought about, they experienced a change in themselves, even though it could be quite temporary, because there was a certain shift in their own being through going through this process. And I think anybody who works artistically will immediately be able to relate to that if you work intensively with an art experience, then something in your own being changes. But often what they would say is, I found myself in another space, a space, that I hadn't been in before, and I don't know how I got there. I found myself there. I couldn't stay there, but I felt this this change in me, a shift, you might say, this is my words, in their consciousness, even though it being a one-off for them, it was a temporary thing. And this is one of the things that we're really looking at in phenomenology is, as I said, and in earlier sessions, and has been stressed by various people in the earlier sessions who gave us presentations on their practical work, that it's not just about revealing the essence of a phenomenon. It's also about bringing about a change in ourselves. It is a transformation of our own being. And as Parker Palmer says, then this new ways of knowing becomes a way of living, and our relationship to the world changes. So that's one aspect of the just checking my time. That's looking at this soul's image of the soul, the after image, that one can build up this inner world, this body of inner imaginations, become more and more precise and build up this rich inner world by constantly working with what arises in the space afterwards, if we give ourselves the time to do it. And in a minute, I'm going to do an exercise with you, which is a bit of a development of Zionce's cognitive breathing exercise. The second aspect, though, that after the after image, is that you then start to work with letting go of the after image. So whereas at the first iteration, you work with the sense perceptible world and what arises, you create the image and then you let it go, and there is an after image, hopefully, arises in your soul. And this is, you know, this can be a very slow process. Might take repeated immersions before anything appears as an after image, because again we have to develop that capacity to be receptive, which is not something we, as we talked about last time, we necessarily have. But then the second iteration is that you then start letting go of the after image. So the focus is on the after image, and then the open attention is then on the processes that can, once the after image falls away, we can start to focus on the source of the processes we use to generate that after image, the thought activity, which is in self. Now we're coming towards the spiritual activity behind or within the image. And anyone who's worked with Rudolf Steiner's knowledge of higher worlds preparatory exercises, so the very first exercise where we're asked to work with the growing plant and the dying plant, that first of all we have the growing leafing plant, and then we have its counter image, which is the withering, dying plant. But then he says that what in fact should happen is that when we work with this, that we have an experience of the life processes behind the growing and dying plant can arise in our soul. And that is, of course, the process of the rising sun, or behind, as the after image, you might say, or the activity behind the growing plant, and the processes that are embodied in the rising moon. So not the setting sun, as one might naturally think, but behind the withering, the spiritual activity behind the withering plant is the rising moon. And earlier in this year, my painting class, we worked with this over 7 weeks, fortnights, so 14 weeks. And as since I've got 2 people here tonight who are in that group, will know how incredibly difficult it was to actually work with this, to work really, not just take this on as a sort of an idea that, oh well, Steiner said this, so therefore it must be, but to actually have, well, you might say, a lived experience of those forces behind the growing and withering plant. And I find it interesting when I think about it in relation to science's cognitive breathing exercise, is that these forces in the growing phase are very much like a focused attention. And the forces in the withering are where the forces go out into the periphery. And anyone who knows the Rudolf Steiner's motif of the rising sun in his 9 training sketches knows that these processes are very evident, that the processes, he very clearly shows in his motif how these processes go out to the periphery. So we really have in this exercise for knowledge of higher worlds, this same picture of the focused attention and then this receptivity of going out to the periphery. So I'm not going to go any further into that aspect this time because I wanted to leave that for our final webinar of the year, in November. We're all still able to, we're all still here. We're all going to get together. And I'd just like to now stop talking and do this actual exercise on what I call, I'm using Goethe's term, beholding, to call it a beholding exercise, which uses both Zientz's cognitive breathing. I've customized his cognitive breathing to fit my needs, and I've also drawing on a little bit perhaps what Jude touched on, but particularly what Rudolf Steiner says in relation to our sense perceptions in the far past were much more comprehensive and and multifaceted than they are today. So that when one looked at something, we didn't just see it, we actually had an experience that may have taste and touch and other aspects to it. So before I go any further with this exercise, I want you to look around you and find an object. I don't recommend a pencil. Maybe something a little bit more complex. I'll just give you a moment to, I can see most people's background, I can see all kinds of interesting objects. So just find yourself an object. And I'm going to lead you through this exercise just as Zientz did with his, just through the steps. So if everybody has their object, of course, our first thing is to sit back and relax and try and open ourselves to looking at this object, which is going to be very familiar to you probably because it's in your home. For most people, it's in their home space. So you probably know it very well. So you have to now look at it and try and look at it with, open ourselves to wonder at the object. Yeah. So that's our first step. So you may like just to sit for a moment and cultivate a moment of openness. May just even be just taking a deep breath in and then a deep breath out. And then I want you to look at the object, but look at the object in such a way as you survey the phenomenal field. So it's not just the object, but you gaze at it and run your eye over, you might say, its surrounds, its context, yeah? That might mean taking in the desk that you're sitting at or the room you're sitting in, but just allow your attention to scan the whole area around the object. can help to do this with slightly unfocused eyes. So if you wear glasses like I do, you take them off. And then when you look then at your object and around the object, then you won't immediately focus on the details. You'll just see it in its wholeness, it's in its entirety. And then I would like you to imagine a hand coming out from your eye. So you're not actually going to touch the object, but you imagine your eye going through the same activity as if you were reaching out with your hand and explore your object with your hand eye. Trace its form, feel its surfaces without touching it. Turn your eye into a kind of a hand, a sensing, give it a sensing that lives into the object. Now I want you to close your eyes and try and recall the object from memory. Bring it back, bring it into your mind's eye. And then, still keeping your eyes closed, just let it go. Just let go of the image. And then open your eyes and go through the same process of reaching out with your hand eye. And this time, see if you can go into more detail. Maybe you have a simple object and there's not much detail, but see if you can go further into the object by your observation, you might say, becomes embodied in the object, and try and take in the details. And then close your eyes and once again, recall the image, recall the object in your imagination with as much detail as you can. Really try to build it up in your mind's eye exactly as you observed it. And then let it go. And then look at the object a third time. And again with your hand eye. Once again. Really trace it, sort of feel it, all its different aspects, its qualities. Of all the qualities, are there any new qualities, things you didn't notice? Engage again, this third time again, with really observing it as closely as possible. Then close your eyes, and for the third time, build the image up in your mind's eye, in its detail, but also bring its surrounds into the detail as much as you can. So it's not just the object detached from its surround, but as much as possible, clearly and precisely, the area, it's the field, you might say, within which it stands or sits or lies or exists. And then let it go. Let it go completely. Let it go, and with your eyes still closed, this time sit back metaphorically or maybe literally and open ourselves to being receptive to anything that may come to us. Open up that inner space to any after image, after sensation. This may help, as Zion says, to send your attention right out to the periphery so that you're not actually trying too hard. Just really make your center a space that opens up within. Be receptive to whatever comes. And then open your eyes and just, you might then like to give a word of thanks, a moment of gratitude, but also important to just close that inner space down and come, as we come back into our everyday consciousness, and just come back into this virtual space together. Oh, how did that work for you? Anybody like to say a word of their experience?
I like what I experienced was the 3 times of coming back into observing the object. Sort of went through a phase of, okay, I've got it. Oh, then I realized I haven't got, there's a lot of it I haven't got. And it's actually quite rewarding to do it 3 times. And then you realize there's a lot in this, you know. In terms of the after image or the what lives afterwards, I couldn't say, you know, I'd probably been too distracted. But it was an interesting exercise, the observation and realizing how much there is into observing something fairly trivial, you know.
Especially moving before one needs to move between the phenomenal field and the detail, and then, you know, it's also from the whole to the parts, and the parts, you know, very much, that's very a Goethean thing, isn't it? That moving from the parts and the whole and the parts. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, so this is what I looked at. A little vase with a marigold in it, which I picked this morning for my workroom. And which, you know, you pick flowers to adorn the room, but I really had paid absolutely no attention to this poor little thing. And so yeah, it was an interesting exercise to I loved what Jude said about that thing of going, you know, with your will going out into the marigold and the little vase, and something wanting to come towards you. And I could kind of feel it, but I was trying to hold it back because I knew that the vase had a story, because somebody had given it to me in one of my workshops. So in the after image, I got this incredible feeling of like sadness came over me, and I go, oh, where on earth would have that come from? And then it just kind of felt like I'd picked this poor little flower, and I just totally taken it for granted. You know, I go out and pick flowers, and I don't ask, can I pick you? You know, and how it had sort of sacrificed its beauty, you know, into my workroom, where I'd had a really busy day of clients coming in, and you know, did anyone notice it? I don't know, but it was probably doing its thing without me noticing anyway. So yeah, it was quite a lovely little exercise. Got to know me marigold, I did.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
could see the problem of moving between the marigold and the vase, you know, but nevertheless, it's the marigold needed the vase in order that now that it was no longer in the ground, didn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah.
it had to be part of the exercise. Yeah,
That's right. Yeah.
yeah. Did anyone have, apart from Kate, an after image, anything arise? Joanna?
I had a little Agathea daisy, which was not in a vase. And on the second look at the daisy, I could swear the petals were moving. It was so extraordinary. I probably made it up, but it was almost as though it was saying, yes, and I can see you too. And then I felt, as a previous speaker did, Mark, I think, how much more each time I noticed. But I still had this weird feeling of seeing the petals move. But when I had the after image, it was very definitely a deep red color. And in the center of the deep red color was a spiral, not very definitely drawn, but there was a spiral going on in the middle. So there was something growing or alive or something there in the middle of that red color. And it was quite a surprise, and I kept peering to see if I was really seeing it, and I seemed to be really seeing it, and it was definitely active. So thank you.
Yeah, Diane.
I'm a bit hesitant to jump in because I think I picked up, I don't know how important the thing is that you pick up, because I picked up something that I'd made. And so it had a resonance of my own.
Yeah.
So I stuffed myself up, you know, I don't know.
Yeah.
It didn't get much direction in that way. And what's your thought about that?
I think there's a certain validity in that, Diane, that you did make it. and therefore you have already a certain connection to it. So how do you look at it with new eyes? Nevertheless, it's an entity in itself still, isn't it? It's not, it's made with, it's got its own materiality of the world that has got nothing to do with you. Yeah, there's all these different aspects of it. So I don't think it's, you know, invalid because you made it, but yeah. So
yeah, okay, yeah. That's curious. Yeah, it did. It had a resonance of its own, which is what one hopes for when you make something anyway. So
yeah,
just leave it at that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So obviously, you know, three immersions. I mean, that's nothing really, is it? I'm sure you all see that it actually, this is something one has to do again and again and again. And the more you do it, even, you know, it doesn't have to, it can be still quite a simple object, but you can imagine with a plant, for instance, of course, there's a whole aspect of where the plant grows, you know, not just a plant in itself, but that also goes for any object or a sound, or, you know, one can do that with music. So, and the after image, of course, the first after image you have, one documents that, but one can't just say, oh, well, that was the after image, because that's not a precise building up, is it? That's just from one experience. It's, you actually have to go through, a rigorous process of documenting whatever after image you have, or, you know, whatever sensation or whatever inner gesture, so that you over time build up this, as I said, it's an imaginative picture, but it's also a precise one. Yeah, it's this description, again, not just of the object, not of that which is observed, but of a description of the after image, so that one isn't just, you know, it doesn't just become a kind of a fantasy. You know, we try and get rid of the fantasy element and stay with come close to the true imagination of it. So, as we've said over these sessions, it is a slow process. It does require this repeated immersion, but, you know, the more one immerses oneself in it, it's like the breathing. The deeper the breath, the greater the out breath. Yeah. So one develops a much stronger relationship to it, and then you can develop a much greater receptivity to it. So yeah. So we must close. Yeah. So I'm just going to close now. So as I said, next time I'd like to hopefully move on. I'd like to then just to wrap up the end of the year by looking at the next stage of letting go of the after image. If that's one thing that one aspect that we'll look at in the November webinar. But yeah, so there will be a recording of this available for anybody who wants to revisit any of it, also with some references on it. And I think that I might just finish with the Rilke verse. Yeah. Through all beings stretches one space, world inner space. The birds fly quietly through us. Oh, I who wish to grow, I look out, and inside me the tree grows.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you to everybody for coming along and sharing, and
see you next time.
see you next time. Okay,
Thank
then.
you.
Good night. Thanks for staying
Yeah,
the whole
thank you.
stretch. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.